Once the Balkans were part of Roman civilization, full of cities, roads, and temples, and then other peoples arrived. Their names, language, and customs were foreign to the local people, but after a few centuries they became native here. These people did not conquer the Balkans in a single decisive battle. They came in waves, slowly but inevitably. Who were they? How did they manage to take root in the lands of the empire? And why did the Slavs become the foundation of many peoples in this region? Hello, you're on the Amazing History channel, where history is told vividly and without unnecessary pomp. Today we'll talk about how the Slavs appeared in the Balkans and why this is one of the most underrated migrations in European history. Before we begin, I want to thank the viewers of the channel for your support in the comments, as well as the sponsors for your financial support. Thanks to you, we can now spend more on creating animations in our videos. Now, let's get to the topic of this episode. The first written mentions of the Slavs appear in Byzantine sources of the 6th century historians of that time, such as Procopius of Caesarea and Jordanes, called them by different names. These names most likely did not refer to specific peoples who lived in the territories of modern Ukraine and Poland. Modern scholars suggest that these were rural communities speaking ancient Slavic dialects, with primitive organization and strong joy. At first, they were seen as borderland barbarians, no more dangerous than dozens of other nomadic peoples. Byzantium even hired them as allies to protect its borders. Together with another powerful player of that time, the Avar Khaganate, they took part in campaigns against common enemies. Avaro-Slavic alliances were convenient for both sides. The Avars provided military leadership, while the Slavs contributed numbers and flexibility. Byzantium, on the other hand, used them as a buffer against more dangerous threats from the north and east. But over time, these allies began to penetrate deeper and deeper, crossing the Danube and settling in new lands, more and more often not with permission but by force. While the empire was fighting the Persians and dealing with internal crises, new settlers occupied abandoned villages, built their own homes, and brought with them different customs. The settlement of the Slavs in the Balkans did not happen all at once, but in several waves, the first of which occurred back in the 6th century amid the weakening of Byzantium. Slavic groups crossed the Danube in small detachments, settling in sparsely populated or devastated regions. They weren't accompanied by armies, but still settled in new lands. They knew how to survive in the forest, build and defend themselves. The threat did not come from invasion, but from constant presence. The next, more significant wave came in the 7th century when, in the midst of the Byzantine Sassanid War, the empire was barely holding its eastern frontiers. It was during this period that the Slavs, often under the cover of the Avar Khaganate, began to carry out large-scale raids, reaching even the walls of Constantinople. Some of these raids were devastating, but some of the Slavic tribes stayed in place and gradually settled in Mysia, Thrace, Macedonia, and Epirus. The third wave, more scattered and peaceful, belongs to the 8th century, when the Slavs were no longer seen as invaders, but as one of the forces with which the Byzantine administration had to negotiate. The empire was experiencing the consequences of Arab expansion and civil wars, and its influence in the Central and Western Balkans had practically disappeared. This allowed the new settlers to move even further south, all the way to the Peloponnese. Despite such large-scale resettlement, it cannot be said that the indigenous population was completely displaced. Advocates. Archaeological findings indicate the coexistence of the Slavs with the remaining Illyrians, Thracians, Greeks, and Romance-speaking groups. In ceramics, architecture, and burial rites, a gradual blending of cultures can be seen. The Balkans did not become Slavic in a single generation. They became a territory of complex cultural symbiosis, where new peoples intertwined with the old. At first, the Byzantines tried to ignore the Slavs. The empire was occupied with more dangerous enemies, Persia in the east and the Arabs in the south. But as reports of the Slavs increased and their settlements drew ever closer, it became impossible to ignore them any longer. By the 8th century, it became clear that the Balkans were no longer Byzantine, neither politically nor culturally. At first, Constantinople's reaction was rather passive. Having lost control over the roads and fortresses, the Byzantines focused on defending the coasts and key cities. But gradually, an active counter-strategy began. The empire returned to long-tested methods. Some of the Slavs were resettled deep into Asia Minor for service and under supervision. Garrisons and settlers from other regions of the empire were sent to the liberated areas. The goal was simple: to break tribal ties and disrupt their settlement. Military pressure was accompanied by diplomacy. Byzantium readily recognized local chiefs if they agreed to serve. They were given titles, sent gifts, and sometimes their children were taken as hostages to be raised at the court. This was a subtle policy, not conquest, but drawing them into the system. Religion was used especially actively. Christianity became a means of influence and control. Over time, this tactic began to bear fruit. Some Slavic groups became allies, accepted baptism, and even retained a certain autonomy under Byzantine protection. But the people of Constantinople had no illusions either. The Balkans were already different, and the empire had to coexist with the new ethnic landscape not as a master, but as one of the players. The Slavs did not just come to the Balkans, they settled them in different ways. Southern regions, such as the Peloponnese and Thessaly, were foreign to them. Here, the Greek urban population remained, along with remnants of Byzantine influence. Many Slavs either assimilated into the local environment or were later relocated. Individual toponyms with clear Slavic roots are almost all that remains of their presence in the south. But in the northern and central parts of the Balkans, the situation was completely different. The vast lands of modern Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, and Bulgaria became the center of Slavic settlement. In these regions, administrative control had already been disrupted, and the local population had suffered greatly. During the early invasions, Slavic communities took firm root here, and later, the first state formations would emerge based on them. One such example was the White Croats, a tribe that, according to later sources, migrated from the Carpathians toward the Adriatic. It is possible that they became the core of the future Croatian identity, although most likely we are talking about a complex mix of Slavs, Romanized Illyrians, and other local peoples. In the east, in the region of Thrace and Moesia, the Slavs came into contact with the Turkic Bulgars, and this alliance gave rise to a new ethnic group and the future state of Bulgaria. In the area of present-day Montenegro and northern Albania, Slavic entities emerged, which would later become the principalities of Duklja and Travunia, and to the south of them, a Serbian political structure was emerging, not yet centralized, but already with its own rulers and its own trajectory. Everywhere, one pattern is clear. The fate of each Slavic tribe was determined by themselves, but also by those they lived alongside. Before Slavic states appeared in the Balkans, there were Slavic societies, simple but viable, and importantly, we know almost nothing about them firsthand. All early descriptions of the Slavs came from the Byzantines, who were often hostile and always outsiders. They called the Slavs Sklavins and portrayed them as barbarians prone to violence and looting. But behind these cliches, you can catch something important. Slavic tribes apparently did not have centralized authority. Their lives were organized around clan and rural communities. Governance was decentralized, and decisions were made collectively by elders or at popular assemblies. In case of a threat, such communities could unite, forming temporary alliances. Sometimes this was called military democracy, although that's more of an external observation than an exact term. The culture of the Sklavins was diverse. They had no written language, but they had oral traditions, paganism, rituals, and shared myths. Some deities, like the mysterious Svetovit or Svarožić, appear in the folklore of different Slavic regions, which indicates a broad cultural background. At the same time, each group developed depending on its environment. Some adapted more quickly to Byzantine influence, while others maintained isolated originality. A distinctive feature of early Slavic society was its flexibility. These people easily adapted to local conditions, quickly adopted what was useful, but did not lose their foundations. That is why they were so confident in settling new territories. Where the Roman Empire left ruins, the Slavs built villages. Where other tribes could not hold on, they put down roots. The Slavs came to the Balkans as free tribes, but they did not remain that way for long. By the 8th and 9th centuries, they began to unite into large political structures. This resulted not only from internal maturity, but also from the era's challenges, a weakened Byzantium, Frankish pressure, and stronger neighboring peoples. In order to survive, they had to build states. In the Western Balkans, closer to the Adriatic, Croatia emerged. Its core was probably formed by groups of settlers from the north and local Slavic communities. At first, the Croats lived under the formal dependence of the Franks, and then they gained recognition from Byzantium. By the 10th century, there was already a kingdom here with its own writing system, a complex church structure, and active foreign relations. Religiously, Croatia wavered between Constantinople and Rome, and only finally chose Catholicism after the Great Schism of 1054. In the center of the peninsula, Serbia began to form as Slavic tribes living in the areas of present-day Montenegro, Kosovo, and southern Serbia, united into principalities such as Raška and Zeta. Here, Byzantine influence was stronger, and Christianization followed the Eastern Rite. In the 11th and 12th centuries, Serbian statehood emerged, followed by the Serbian Orthodox Church, which was independent and had its own canon law. Meanwhile, in the east, Bulgaria was taking shape. Here, things were different. The Slavs mixed with the Turkic-speaking Bulgars who arrived in the 7th century, creating an entirely new people. Bulgaria quickly turned into a powerful kingdom that rivaled Byzantium. Under Tsar Simeon VI, the Bulgarians even claimed the title of Emperors of the Romans and fought for spiritual leadership in the Orthodox world. Here, based on the Glagolitic script, the Cyrillic alphabet was created, which became a cultural weapon for the entire Slavic Orthodox tradition. These first states were not homogeneous. Their culture was a blend of paganism, Christianity, Byzantine, and local traditions. But it was precisely in these multinational flexible entities that the very Slavic Balkan civilization was born, which we know through its architecture, writing, and spiritual culture. By the time the first Slavic states had grown strong, Byzantium could no longer regain its lost power. The empire shifted its approach from weapons to culture. If the Slavs were not going to disappear, they could be transformed. Thus began the era of Christianization and cultural integration. The first step was religion. Through missionaries, marriages, and political agreements, the Slavs began to be baptized en masse. The adoption of Christianity not only made dialogue with Constantinople easier, it opened the doors to the world of literacy, worship, and education. The most prominent symbols of this cultural expansion were two brothers from Thessaloniki, Kirill and Methody. It was they who created the first Slavic alphabet, Glagolitic, which later transformed into Cyrillic, but the cultural influence of Byzantium did not mean submission. Bulgaria, for example, used Christianity as a tool of independence. By creating its own Orthodox Church, it challenged the spiritual primacy of Constantinople. In Serbia, the church became the foundation of national identity, and the rulers acted as defenders of the faith, not as vassals of the empire. Even those who formally maintained loyalty were increasingly playing their own political game. Secular culture also flourished. Laws, chronicles, temple architecture. The Balkan Slavs began to create their own schools of theology, their own literature, their own version of high culture. This was not just an export of the Byzantine model, but its reworking and adaptation to local conditions and ambitions. Thus, Byzantium was not simply losing influence, it was inadvertently sharing it in the struggle for control over the Balkans. Cultural expansion became a two-way process. The Slavs absorbed the Byzantine tradition, but used it for their own purposes. And the more they became Christianized, the more actively they turned into independent political and spiritual centers. By the beginning of the Middle Ages, the Slavs were no longer newcomers to the Balkans, but had become part of its foundation. Their path here was neither quick nor straightforward. It was a story of thousands of families, migrations, clashes, and compromises. Once they came to the lands of the former empire without writing, without cities, and without political structures. Centuries later, they built temples, created laws, and negotiated with emperors. The Balkan region turned into a complex mosaic, where the Slavic language was spoken alongside Greek, Latin, Albanian, and others. Kingdoms and principalities, churches and armies, customs and chronicles emerged. The influence of Rome, Byzantium, and later the Ottoman Empire and Catholic West left their mark on every Slavic state. None of them disappeared without a trace. Today, looking at the map, we see the legacy of this migration. Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Slovenia are not just countries, they are the descendants of those who once crossed the Danube in search of a new home, and it was they who made the Balkans what they became, a crossroads of empires, cultures, and peoples. Well, that's all from me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye, everyone.